You may have noticed something a little off about the tone of that last video. In it, I expressed my reservations about the direction Nintendo is heading right now, but ended on a note of optimism with the observation that Nintendo is a great company full of talented people, and they can surely capture the spirit of their past if they want to. Which is entirely the wrong note to end on for a series about the competition between Nintendo and its long-term rivals. I mean, what the heck am I, Sesame Street? Did I not originally describe Nintendo's experience in the 60s and 70s as a war? Because the thing about wars is that they end up with winners and losers. In Star Wars, Luke Skywalker is the winner, and the loser is anyone who bought beachfront real estate on Alderaan. In the War of the Worlds, the losers are all the dead aliens and human civilization, and the winner is bacteria. Life is not all sunshine, lollipops, and rainbows. Yes, now and then Nintendo got along with its rivals and they worked on stuff together. Big whoop. That doesn't mean they weren't all waiting for the chance to stick a knife into everybody else's back and run off with all the profits. The one who dies with the most toys sold wins. So we've got one last question to answer here. Of the 7 companies that stepped into this commercial Thunderdome, which walked out with its head held high, and which ended up as a coffee stain on the carpet? Nintendo and its rivals technically all survived to the modern day in one form or another, as brands at least. But one interesting fact is that apart from Nintendo, they've all either merged with or been acquired by other companies in the 4 decades that have passed since the dawn of the NES. As a result of this inexorable process, we only have 5 competitors left to rank. Taking them in order of when we first encountered them, they are Nintendo, which is, well, it's Nintendo. If you've gotten this far, I assume you know something about it. It makes video games, co-produces animated movies with Illumination, operates a mini amusement park inside Universal Studios, owns a sizable piece of the largest media franchise in the world, and sells very expensive alarm clocks. Takara Tomy, known simply as Tomy in the West, a company formed by the merger of Takara and Tomy in 2006, which still primarily sells toys, although it does have its hands in several related businesses. Bandai Namco, a company formed from the merger of Bandai and Namco in 2005, and formerly referred to as Namco Bandai, in case you weren't mixed up enough already, which is probably the most diverse conglomerate of all our participants. It sells toys and games, runs arcades, restaurants, and amusement parks, produces pop music and anime, and thanks to a lucrative partnership with developer From Software, also owns the souls of millions and is secretly concentrating them into a dark magic which will someday be powerful enough to either control or destroy all of humanity. Oh wait, that's Demon's Souls, which is owned by Sony. Never mind, forget I said anything. Taito, which is no longer independent, having been bought out by Square Enix in 2005. Noticing a pattern here? A minor player in the video game world since it was acquired, Taito these days mostly produces ports of its old arcade titles for modern platforms, makes toys and figurines, and runs its own chain of arcades. Apparently it's been working on some original games too, but that doesn't seem to have gone anywhere just yet. And last, but certainly not least, Sega Sammy, formed from the merger of Sega and Sammy in 2004. Don't know what Sammy is? Yeah, me neither, at least until recently. It made a handful of video games in the 90s and early 2000s, mostly Japan exclusive, but apparently its real bread and butter back in the day was pachinko machines. Sega Sammy is best known for making video games today, but it's involved in a surprising number of other ventures, including owning the prestige animation studio TMS Entertainment and having a part interest in the indoor theme park chain Joypolis. It also owns a minority stake in Sanrio, which is a good thing to have given the recent success of Hello Kitty Island Adventure, but that's getting a little off topic. There are many different ways to measure a company's size or importance, but for this ranking I'm going to use one of the simplest. Market capitalization, which is basically the aggregated value of all outstanding shares of company stock. That is, the number of shares owned times the current share price. This isn't always an ideal metric to follow if you're looking for stocks to buy, since it's highly variable and leaves out considerations like debt and future earning potential. But if you want an instant temperature read on what the market in general thinks of a company, this is it. Also, all of the companies we're looking at today are Japanese, meaning that, among other things, generally speaking, they don't load themselves up with debt. I'll just mention in passing that if I did consider debt as a factor, that would really just push the winners even farther ahead. It wouldn't change the ranking much. After naming each player, I'll explain briefly how it got to its current position and what it's been involved with since our last encounter. It'll be just like Behind the Music, but with no lip-syncing scandals or drug problems. Well, fewer drug problems anyway. One other point before we get started. I'm going to credit each player with the value of the company it's a part of, and not try to break out individual divisions. This is mostly beneficial to Taito, which would probably end up dead last, except that it happens to have been bought by Square Enix, a gaming giant which is many times larger than Taito by itself would be. I know that's not really fair, and it gives companies credit just for being bought out. But you know what else rewards companies just for getting bought out? The market. And you know what else isn't fair? Business. Business is not fair. So without further ado, let's see who the amusement business was most unfair to. And that is... Number 5. Takara Tomy. Yes, that's right. These two are the Neptune and Pluto of our amusement solar system, and that metaphor works even better because when we last left them, they'd temporarily swapped places. Entrenched leader Tomy had been struggling a little with its electronic games, while perpetual underdog Takara surged ahead with the success of Hasbro's Transformers franchise, which was based on its toys. Tomy fought back with Zoids, its own transforming robot concept which came in both toy and model kit form, but it never posed any serious threat to the enormous profits made by Transformers and Bandai's Gunpla. For many years, the niche that Tomy dominated was handheld non-electronic toys, most of which weren't nearly as elaborate as the all-time king Screwball Scramble. But they do have a certain nostalgic quality to them, like the Waterfuls series, which were filled with water and used jets to play games like Ring Toss and Tic-Tac-Toe. The 1990s was probably Tomy's peak as an independent toy company, as it managed to snag a license that Bandai had foolishly let slip away. Pokémon, which made a merchandising fortune pretty much right away, and Tomy was at the forefront of that. Bandai fought back with Digimon, and Takara with Beyblade and Duel Masters, in what was rapidly becoming a media franchise arms race. By the end of the slugfest, Bandai was still on top, but it was concerned enough to go after Namco for a merger, which is probably what drove Tomy and Takara to merge themselves the next year. Tomy was the larger partner, with its shares counting for more than 5 times as much as Takara's, but in terms of the brand value of their major franchises, they were more or less equals. Tomy's strength was the consistent success of its non-franchised toys, like the Waterfuls. And the combined company has essentially followed Tomy's playbook ever since. There are no really famous Tomy toys post-2005, but it's still a very successful toy company with a worldwide presence and many valuable brands to its name. The reason why Tomy Takara is so low on this list is that it's stuck with toys this whole time, a high-cost business compared to video games, and even more competitive. Although video games can be a tough nut to crack too. Just look at our next player if you need proof of that. Number 4. Sega Sammy. Few companies have had as many ups and downs as Sega over the last 40 years. Almost forced out of the console market by Nintendo's monopolistic shenanigans, it fought back by creating all its own games for years, then leapfrogged Nintendo technologically with the Genesis in 1989. When Nintendo's contracts with game developers were up, they were eager to take advantage of Sega's nearly arcade-quality platform and jumped ship, forcing Nintendo to bargain for exclusives like any common scrub. But Sega had trouble following up on this massive success. It fell into the trap of pursuing CD technology before developers were ready to keep up with the new format, and released the Sega CD as a peripheral rather than a new console, in a curious echo of Nintendo's experience with the Famicom Disk System. Then it tried to leapfrog Nintendo a third time with the 32X, developed in response to Atari's supposedly advanced Jaguar system in 1993. If Sega had had a crystal ball back then, it could have just sat back and waited for the Jaguar to glitch itself to death. Instead, it made the costly mistake of piling into the same market, and ended up selling about as many units as Nintendo's Virtual Boy. The Saturn, also CD-driven, like the soon-to-be-released Sony PlayStation, fared a lot better than Sega's last two consoles, but not well enough to check its loss of market share. The best-selling games on the N64 and PlayStation, Super Mario 64 and Gran Turismo respectively, each sold more than 10 million copies. The Saturn's equivalent, Virtua Fighter 2, sold about 2.5 million. Sega was largely carried during this period by the enduring popularity of arcades, where it continued to excel with games like Daytona USA, Virtua Cop, and The House of the Dead. With its final home console, Sega hoped to scoop both Nintendo and Sony, and this time it hit the cutting edge so hard it was sliced to ribbons. The Dreamcast was probably the most forward-looking video game console ever created. It had robust online capabilities from the moment of its release at the end of 1998, anticipating a trend that Microsoft and Sony would cash in on massively by the mid-2000s, and many of its games had revolutionary features that wouldn't appear elsewhere for years. But being this advanced was expensive, and Sega needed the Dreamcast to be an immediate success to pay back these costs. It didn't work out that way. Still satisfied with 5th-generation technology, customers largely passed on the Dreamcast and waited to see what Sega's competitors would do. Sony's PlayStation 2, released a little more than a year later for the same price and with substantially more third-party support, was the final nail in the coffin for Sega's ambitions, and by mid-2001 the Dreamcast was finished. The modern Sega Sammy was created in 2004, when Sammy Corporation bought Sega, its stock price still reeling from the collapse of its home division. Sega's first major game post-acquisition was actually 2005's Shadow the Hedgehog, which I doubt anybody would call a comeback, not to mention the truly horrendous Sonic the Hedgehog, better known as Sonic 06, which Sega released the next year. But it also kept making games in series like Super Monkey Ball and Crazy Taxi, which were developed prior to the merger with Sammy, and also made an interesting little adventure game set in Japan's criminal underworld known as Yakuza, starting a long-running franchise that you may have heard of. These days, Sega is still probably best known for Sonic and Yakuza, but it also owns Rovio, the creators of Angry Birds, and Atlus, the creators of the RPG series Shin Megami Tensei and its more famous spin-off, Persona. It's not at all what I'd call a big shot among game studios, but it's still not a player that it would be safe to comfortably ignore. Sega still innovates and is still beloved by many gamers. It's just that these days, a new game from it is just as likely to come out on a Nintendo console as not. Officially, the big N and the little s are friends again, though you never can tell what might happen next generation. Number 3. Taito. Strictly speaking, Taito is probably the worst performer on this list. Unlike Sega, it didn't even have the dubious honor of being acquired by a less prominent company and getting shared name privileges. Instead, it was bought lock, stock, and barrel by Square Enix in 2006. While it kept its lead in non-video arcade machines, like prize grabbers, which are not as high margin as you might think from watching comedy anime where someone drops $30 trying to get a plushie, Taito fell pretty far behind Nintendo and Sega in the arcade world after 1986, the same year that a majority of its stock was purchased by the Japanese electronics conglomerate Kyocera. Taito's experience was somewhat similar to Namco's, except that Namco had a sort of renaissance in the 90s, with series like Ridge Racer, Tekken, Soul Calibur, and Mr. Driller, while Taito had to lean on Puzzle Bobble and Densha de Go, which never managed to become hits outside Japan. The company's American branch closed down in mid-1996, and the European branch in 1998. With nothing left except its original Japanese division and portfolio of nostalgic brands, Taito was an appealing target for some high-flying Japanese company to acquire and restructure. Square Enix ended up taking the bait, just a few years after the merger that brought it into existence, funnily enough. Taito has been reorganized several times under Square Enix, and has nothing like its original corporate structure anymore. At this point, it really is just a brand that the parent company uses to market games and series specifically associated with the name, like Space Invaders and Bubble Bobble. Also, Squeenix itself hasn't been doing so hot over the last several years, with some dud projects and overinvestment in other game studios like, well, Taito, dragging it down. Back in 2022, it disgorged several studios it had bought or formed about a decade earlier, and IPs associated with them, including Tomb Raider, Thief, and Deus Ex, some of their most prominent Western titles of the 21st century. Could Taito be the next to be spun off if management doesn't get its act together? It's possible, although since they're both Japanese, their relationship is probably seen as having more synergy than Square Enix publishing Tomb Raider games. Whichever way that goes, I imagine Taito's history is going to be a bit more interesting in the near future than it's been for a good long time. Number 2. Bandai Namco. While Sega is the kind of company that you've probably heard of whether or not you play any of its games, Bandai Namco is more like the kind of company whose games you probably play whether or not you've heard of them. Bandai has made quite a variety of interesting and nostalgic products, and while I was doing research for these videos, I was constantly stopping and saying, hold on, Bandai made that? Probably its most ambitious move after 1985, other than creating Digimon of course, was its push into the video game market in the 90s. We've already seen stuff like the LCD Solar Power, which competed with Nintendo's Game & Watch, but Bandai went a lot further than that, following Nintendo all the way into proper game consoles. Its Playdia, from 1994, was aimed at a fairly young audience and didn't have much of a library. It was kind of like an early Leapster, although not as successful, unfortunately. Where it really started to innovate, though, was the Wonder Swan, a Japan-exclusive portable console, most remembered in the West as the last project that former Nintendo luminary Gunpei Yokoi worked on before the car accident that took his life in 1997. And his approach of lateral thinking with withered technology was certainly on full display here. The Wonder Swan was more powerful and had a longer battery life than the Game Boy, while using 75% less energy. It was really a marvel of a console, but it suffered from a lack of third-party support, since Nintendo's position in portables during the late 90s was just as strong as it had been generally in the late 80s. To prove it owned the portable market, Nintendo fired back with the Game Boy Advance, an incredible portable console with a superior library of games. As a result, Bandai lost confidence in the Wonder Swan, and discontinued it when it had only managed a few million in sales, allowing the portable world to fall under Nintendo's sway once again. Meanwhile, Namco was having a fantastic decade, even if it wasn't as famous as it had been at the height of Pac-Man fever. I've already mentioned their arcade comeback during the 90s, but this is also the era when their affiliate Wolf Team created the very successful Tales series of RPGs, while Namco itself made the cult hit Klonoa: Door to Phantomile, and continued to have success with Pac-Man spin-offs, even managing to push him into 3D successfully with the Pac-Man World sub-series. Seriously, I would never have predicted that they would be able to make this work. Within a few years, they would be making Donkey Konga and Star Fox Assault for Nintendo, and Katamari Damacy for Sony, publishing Baten Kaitos, a game I will literally die defending. This is just an amazing company. I love them. The merger between Bandai and Namco in 2006 is the only one on the list that seems to have come from a position of strength rather than weakness. Both companies were still titans of their respective industries, toys and video games, and they just seemed to feel that by working together, they could make some interesting new products and shore up a few weak points. It may also have been that Bandai was uncomfortable trying to establish a foothold in video games on its own after its troubles in the past. As a combined entity, Bandai Namco's biggest hit has unquestionably been the Souls series developed by From Software and its certifiably insane, but in a fun way, creative director Hidetaka Miyazaki. His games have taken an interesting journey over the years, with the original Demon's Souls being published by Sony, along with Bloodborne, while all the Dark Souls games and Elden Ring went to Bandai Namco. And then Sekiro Shadows Die Twice was published by Activision for some reason that escapes me. It's also interesting to note that in recent years, Bandai Namco has done a lot of support work for, and recently had a subsidiary of theirs purchased by, Number 1, Nintendo. You've known from the very beginning it would turn out this way, right? It's the most dramatic way the race could finish, and by this point you should realize that life always imitates art. I'm not going to get into what Nintendo's done since 1985 here, because there's just too much to even pretend to cover adequately. I've talked about it quite a lot in my Year of Mario series, so check that out if you're interested. But this is also an ideal place to start looking into Nintendo's history yourself, because it's been very extensively documented by countless fans and cultural historians. Nintendo was always, from the beginning, a company that refused to know its place, picking fights with more established competitors that supposedly knew their markets inside and out. It'll fight clean, and it'll fight dirty, but the only times it won't fight hard is when it's in such an unassailable position that it doesn't have to fight at all. And whether you're talking about cash on hand or cultural relevance, I don't think there's any question that Nintendo won the Amusement Wars. It won by being more flexible than its competitors, dabbling in more markets and learning more from that dabbling than others did, and by having managers who followed their gut rather than following the leader. Very un-Japanese of them, I know. But when you think about it, a lot of great Japanese cultural products have been produced by rather un-Japanese people, from immigrants like Michael Kogan and David Rosen, to unconventional native sons like Akira Kurosawa. I don't think it's true that Nintendo won because it had the best story, but it might be true that it has the best story because it won, and because it took so long for that question of who won to be resolved. Because its history has so many ups and downs, because it had to go through so much to make it to the top, that's what makes it a great company. It's often been said that Batman is the best superhero, not because of any personal quality he has, but because the villains he fights against are the most interesting. Something very much like that is true of Nintendo. This is a company that would not be what it is without the pressure exerted from outside, the spur to succeed provided by its competitors. Nintendo has a fascinating history because its story is also the story of Tomy, Takara, and Bandai, of Namco, Taito, and Sega, and countless other game developers and publishers who make up the rich tapestry of video games in general. So I'll leave you with this final sentiment. No matter how much you like Nintendo, do your best to be a fan of something besides Nintendo as well. Enjoying Sonic the Hedgehog doesn't mean you don't care enough about Mario, and it never did. In fact, playing and appreciating the games that were rivals to Nintendo's gives you an even better understanding of how great Nintendo's design philosophy really was. Happy hunting, everybody!